All right. This morning I want to talk about the other side. One thing I realized as different as we all are, and we're all different. Huh? No, life would be boring if it was all the same, wouldn't it? But we are all in the same boat. One thing, there are a lot of differences here, but there are things that are very common to all of us. We all wake up every morning and we all fuel our bodies. We pump in some nutrition, whether it's coffee or whether it's a bowl of Wheaties. We pump in some nutrition to get our motor running, as John Kay would say. If you know John Kay, then ask me later if you don't. Now, we pump in that fuel because that fuel takes us throughout the day, takes us from point A to point B. We run out of fuel and we do it all over again. We keep pumping in fuel because we have stuff to do. I mean, just like our cars, I fill up a couple times a week coming up here and going back and forth. But I have to put fuel in the car to get me from point A to point B, from White House, Tennessee to Rineyville, Kentucky. And I thought about getting from point A to point B. You can apply that to the big picture of life, right? We were born and then we die, point A and point B. Or I can look at it in a micro sense. I can look at it in my daily routine where I get up in the morning and I go to work, I clock in at 9:30 and I clock out at 5. Point A to point B. Or it could be that I go to lunch, and I've got a lunch hour, point A when I clock out, point B when I clock back in. We can look at all of life as these little segments where we start and then we end. The disciples, no surprise, were no different. And in Mark chapter 4, if you want to look there, we're going to see an event in their lives where they were going from point A to point B. There's nothing new under the sun. We all fall into that same pattern. We don't always look at it that way, but if we can, how you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? You start and you finish, but there's a few bites in between. And if we can look at life and we can break it apart and look at point A's and point B's, we can know how to get to the other side, because we don't always know. And that's what we were talking about just a second ago, Mark. It's easier to commit, or it's easier to say that Jesus is Lord than to actually commit our lives as if we really believed it. And that's true. I look at my life, I look at y'all's life, I look at everybody's life, and we all, like Steve says, we all fall short of God's holy, holy perfection. God is so holy, and yet he calls us to be holy. And that's our goal, but we don't always hit it because we don't understand. We're going from point A to point B. We don't know the journey, and if we don't know the journey, how do we know how to get there? Google. Who said Google? Of course. Why did I even have to ask who that was? Why did I ask? Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, in the first 34 verses, we see a very long day of ministry where Jesus is teaching the bigger crowd of disciples, where he's doing ministry. And ministry, although sometimes it looks like we don't do a whole lot, we do a little bit more than it appears. But Jesus, I mean, he didn't miss a mark. He didn't miss a point. He laid it all on the line. He left it all out on the field every day. We can assume, rightfully so, that he hit every ministry point on mark, right? He was on point throughout, between point A and point B. We read through it and we just we just kind of glance over that, but was perfect in all that he did. He was on mission in everything. And so after this very long day, we get to chapter 4, verse 35. And let me just read. I want to read through these verses. On the same day, verse 35, on the same day, that same day of ministry, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now, when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern asleep on a pillow, and they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and sea obey him?" All right, and the first thing we see, the first point is the Lord's calling. In verse 35, he says, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over." Go to the next one. "Let us cross over to the other side." Let us cross over. I mean, that's a very simple command, and we wouldn't think too much of it. But if we unpack it as a greater narrative for our lives, that we all live, especially as Christians, under a call, right? We are called out of darkness into light. We're called out of death into life. We're talking about the big picture, but we're also called to live our days as unto the Lord. Do everything as unto the Lord. So when we talk about Jesus being Lord, that takes on a much more significant weight to it than what it would normally when we just kind of let the wind and the waves carry us where they want. Or we were called to go to the other side of this day, this week, this month, with purpose and intention. But the problem is we don't know, or we don't think about, or we don't realize that God is superintending over our lives. Or if we are treating him as Lord, we should be listening for that call. How do I transverse my day? How do I transverse my marriage? How do I go across being a parent? How do I go from point A to point B successfully? Well, the disciples didn't think much about this either. This was one of those little micro calls we see. It's not the macro, not the big picture, but it was hey, we're going from this side of the lake to that side of the lake. Very simple. And then you would think, maybe the disciples thought that because they had finished that long day of ministry, because they had finished church, as it were, right? Ministry on the seashore, listening to the teacher of all teachers. Now that he was asleep, now that he was resting, this was a non-event, right? This is just kind of the filler stuff that you get into in your day that really doesn't make a difference. But au contraire, that's my little bit of French that I know. Au contraire, this was another teachable moment. There are no filler moments with Jesus, right? There is no throwaway, disposable moments as Christians. This was no different. You see, even though he was asleep, he still called them not to get to the other side necessarily, but to teach them something in the middle. So the small, insignificant moments of our life have great significance if we think about it as such. In sales, there's a phrase called ABC. Anybody know what that stands for? Always be closing, right? So when you're talking to I'm not a salesperson. I help folks, but people who are high pressure salespeople are always thinking about going from point A, the introduction, to the close. Always be closing. A, B, and C. Now, as Christians, we should be A, B, and G. Always be growing. Always be growing. We should never let a moment, now this is the goal. This is not what we actually do, but this is the goal. We should always commit every moment to the Lord, because every moment that he gives us is his. I mean, he is the Lord, right? He is sovereign. He is our ruler. He is our king. We are bought with a price. We are not our own. We are simply his vessels to do his will. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is our mantra. This is our calling. This is what we say we believe. And so if we are going to make it so, we must know what it means, point A to point B. We must remember the call of life in each day. Verse, the next slide, please. The next thing we see is their loss of control. Anybody out of control? Okay. So some people are out of control right now. Some people, how many people have ever been out of control? I should see every hand go up at this point, right? Including my own. They lost control. No, not her, me.
Good answer, Beth. Notice how you answered that.
Their loss of control. Look, go to the next slide if you would. Now, when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and the other little boats were also with him. Go to the next one. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. They had set out from the crowd, right? The ministry of Christ was done for the day. Okay. And Jesus said, let us cross over to the other side. Now, here you have the disciples, many of whom were fishermen, right? Many of whom spent their before Christ's days on the lake, day in and day out. They were no strangers to this. And so this was kind of a routine thing. They just assumed that it would be a day like any other day, a crossing like any other crossing, because they were so familiar with it. Like when you go to work or when you go to school or when you go somewhere and you do it on a regular basis, you get very comfortable with it because it becomes routine. Life at times can be very routine until it's not, right? We understand that life is manageable until it's not. And that's what happened. They started losing control. Even though they heard the call to cross over, but they had forgotten it. Why? Because they got into the middle of the sea and the storm arose. No longer were they worried about getting to the other side. They were worried about surviving. And that's what happens. We take our focus off the call onto the circumstances. They were used to that trip. And it says that there were other little boats with them, which meant that if there were little boats with them, guess what they were in? A bigger boat. Here you have seasoned fishermen, seasoned sailors, if you will, in a bigger boat. Not just one of them, but many of the disciples who were fishermen. They were many of them, which gave them more confidence in their ability, right? In a bigger boat. And then the storm arose. It wasn't just a storm. It wasn't just a windy day. It wasn't just a storm. It was a windstorm. But it wasn't just a windstorm. It wasn't a little slight breeze, right? But it was a great windstorm, right? We can handle the little things in life, the little bumps in the road. But this was the mother of all bumps in the road, right? This is the mother of all windstorms as far as they were concerned, because you take a group of people, bless you. Talk about a windstorm. That was a great windstorm. Yes, it was. You take a big boat You take a big boat and you take seasoned sailors, right? And across from point A to point B. I mean, straight. They weren't out there just on a daytime cruise. They were, they knew where they were going. They knew how to get there. They were confident in their vessel, and they were confident in their people in the vessel until a great windstorm arose. And I'm sure they just didn't sit back. You think? I mean, you think they've been in storms before? More than likely. So even in a storm, they were probably confident because they've had storms before. How many of us have had storms before? Right? We either going into a storm, in the middle of a storm, or coming out of a storm. We've all been in storms before. They really had no reason to be concerned. Like when you get up in the morning and everything's going fine, when everything's going well, you don't have any reason to be concerned, do you? You just get up and you start going throughout the routine, right? You do what you do until you have a great windstorm. And so they did, when it started to arise, they didn't just sit around. They didn't just sit around, hey, guys, did you see the forecast? Is this supposed to be getting bad? Wow, no, they were up, steering the rudder or changing the sails, whatever sailors do. I'm a sailor, but you would think I'd been on a boat, but I hadn't. But they were doing what sailors do, and probably if they may have even had a bucket in the boat, right? Because if they have had, when you have a windstorm, when you have something filling your boat, you probably think to yourself, I might want to get a bucket next time to take with me. Just kind of like having an umbrella in case it starts raining. Oh, really? Yeah. Well, they probably didn't know the law, but I imagine they had a bucket. So one guy was, feverishly the bucket. They did. I don't think they had a bilge pump, but no. But they probably had a bucket. They're getting the water out of the boat. They're steering the rudder. They're doing everything they can do. And that's what happens when you get in a storm. You start doing everything you can do. And sometimes those storms are just more than you can handle. And I know it's law. I didn't know it was law to have a bucket, but it's probably law to have a life jacket, which they probably didn't have. So now, okay, they were confident in their vessel, but if the vessel's filling up with water and you're in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a lake, if you've ever been on the lake in a storm, even if you're a swimmer, not a good place to be, right? And without life jackets, they probably thought they were about to go under. I'm sure that crossed their mind. Here's the point. Our control, and I use that in quotation, our control is a deception. Okay? Our control over life is a deception that we believe. It's a lie to think that we have control over anything. Anybody ever had the flu? Did it put you in bed for a day or two? Did you see the flu? You didn't see it, but it took you out, didn't it? It took you down. You have no control. I have no control. If I have the ability to go through a routine, it's only by God's grace. He gives me charge over things. He does not give me control. And when I start thinking I have control, I am buying a lie. I'm placing my confidence in my boat, in my companions, in my abilities to get to the other side. And I'm believing a lie. And God, this is a teachable moment. Because what happens is when we lose control, we lose our confidence. When we lose our control, we lose our confidence. And we should lose our confidence in certain things. If I think I'm confident, I have the ability to make life happen on my own, I need to lose that. If I think I have the ability to do anything on my own. I need to lose that. Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. And he wasn't kidding. We can do nothing apart from him. We are his servants. We are his bondservants. We are his vessels. Let's go to verses 38 and 40. But he was in the stern asleep on a pillow, and they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? But he said to them, why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? Imagine all that they had done before he was awakened. Imagine every time the storm got a little worse and got a little worse, they kept looking back in the boat. Every time they're, okay, maybe if I steer into the wind, okay, he's still asleep. Okay, I'm bailing out the water. Oh, he's still asleep. You know, sure they, hey, be quiet. The master's asleep. We're about to go down. They're yelling, right? Right. The wind is noisy, and they're talking back and forth, and he's still asleep. Imagine, and we were here one Sunday, and the storm rose up, and we could hear the wind outside. Windstorms are not silent, right? Guys who are panicked, trying to save their own tail, are not silent. The waves beating against this wooden box of a boat is not silent. And yet with all of that, they're looking back and they're seeing Jesus asleep in the stern. And finally, they wake him. Now, so to get to that point, here's how it works. We try to do everything we can do to manage, to control our situations, don't we? Not to say that that's a bad thing. We're just not going to sit down and eat Cheetos and watch TV all day. I mean, we need to be productive. God called us to be productive. God called us to ministry. God called us to do what he's called us to do, what he's gifted us to do. That's what we do. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's wrong when we have confidence in our ability to do those things. Not only had they got to the point where they had lost their confidence in their boat, they had lost their confidence in their abilities, they had lost their confidence in the dying down the storm, they had lost confidence in everything. Now they're going to wake Jesus up. And you could see from that comment that they even started to lose confidence in him. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Are you the only one who's not freaked out by this? We're about to go down. The water is filling into the boat. How is it that you're not noticing this? How is it that you can sleep through this? How is it that praise you in the storm? How is it that I'm the only one that's noticing this? How is it that you're not panicked, Lord? How is it that you're not concerned for us? How is it? And so we try to bail ourselves out of situations. I use that word purposefully. We try to bail ourselves out. We try to get the water out of our boat and keep bailing ourselves out until we can't. And then we lose confidence in God, whom we say we believe in. And a lot of people quit at this point because they think that God doesn't care. And yet Jesus says to them, well, I'll get to that in a second. So we get into this activity of trying to bail ourselves out, and we do more and we do faster, and we try everything that we know to fix a situation. And then when it doesn't work, what happens? We start to get worried, right? We start to get consumed with this situation. right? I mean, what else matters, right? I can't worry about tomorrow because I'm about to drown today. We get consumed with it. And so that worry starts to rise in us. And this is what I think he wanted to show them. So I wrote this down, that we should always remember that when he calls us to cross over, he will not let us go under. When he has called us to something, he will call us through something. How is it that you're so fearful? Here's where worry takes place. When you start placing your confidence in everything else instead of the Lord, right? Those things will fail you. Those things will fail me. And we've all been in storms. They've all failed us before. He is the only one who is faithful. I might not perceive what he's doing. It may seem like he's asleep, but he is the only one who has control. If I place my confidence for these other things to control my situations, sooner or later, he's going to test us on that. And so what happens as the crisis rises, as it gets worse and worse, our worry gets worse and worse. Because the more these things fail us, and I've put confidence in these things, the more worry starts to take over. Because now I no longer have confidence in these things. What now am I going to do? Oh yeah, Jesus is in the boat. Let me go ask him. And Jesus gets up like, what's going on? It's like, and that's the last point, the Lord's control. Go to the next two verses, 39, 41. And then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, who can this be that even the wind and sea obey him? See, that's one thing they didn't have control over, right? They can control their boat. They can make sure it's seaworthy. They can control the skill of their passengers, right? They can check the sails, check the ropes, make sure everything's right, make sure they have a bucket by law in the boat. They can check all these things, right? They can even check the weather forecast if they had the ability, right? I don't know if they did that or not. They can check all these things, and they can control those things to a certain point. What they can't control is life, crisis. Because it doesn't matter what you have, there's always a crisis that's bigger than that. And that's where the Lord has control. He's trying to take them from that place of trusting in their ability and their possessions to trusting in him. So he gets up and he's not worried. He's not fearful. He's not freaking out. He's a teacher. He's a carpenter. He's not a fisherman. He's not telling them how to redo the sails or turn the boat this way or that way. When it says he arose, I thought about that. He arose. He said, we live on this plane, right? We live in this world. We live in the physical, right? And Jesus, when he arose, he didn't just stand up. He took authority, his authority, over the circumstance, over the crisis, over what was happening. And he spoke. It's very gentle where it says, peace, be still. It's more like, shut up, be quiet. I mean, it was forceful. The enemy is the prince of the power of the air. The calamity we experience in this world is part of the fall, is part of the curse. The crisis that we go through, sometimes it's our own making, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just because we are in this fallen world. And this world's under a curse. And yet he can stand up above it and speak to the crisis in our lives. But he doesn't necessarily, he's not concerned about that as much, I don't think, as them. You see, as their crisis was arising, their worry was arising, and that storm that was out on the outside was also happening on the inside. And he says, why are you so fearful? Why are you afraid? Why do you have no faith? Don't you know your faith has not been in me? You've seen me do these miracles, and yet your faith is still placed in the other stuff. Your faith is, if your faith was on the solid rock, well, like we talked about this morning, the rock of Christ, the solid rock of our foundation, then you would not be moved. And yet your faith is not in these, in me, it's in these things. And therefore, when the crisis arises, your faith diminishes. And your emotions get out of control. The more chaos, the more fear. The winds and the waves must obey his word, right? Remember we talked about a couple weeks ago that the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. It was formless and void. It was chaotic. And he spoke, right? And said, let there be. He spoke this, that, and the other, and formed this universe. But he hovered over it. He had authority over it. He's outside of this creation. He is not subject to the storms as we are subject to the storms. So when he arose, he took authority over his creation. But he gives us free will. He doesn't give that to the winds and the waves. He can take care of the storms on the outside. What he asks us to do is to walk in faith. And by faith, walk in peace. And by peace, not walk in the chaos that is reflected on the outside. Why are you so fearful? Oh, you have little faith. What are you placing your trust in? Your trust is reflected in your amount of worry, not concern. Not that you shouldn't just sit down and not do anything in the boat, but you shouldn't be overcome and consumed by the waves and the wind. You should be trusting that he who called you from point A is going to see you to point B. Because he said, let us go to the other side. And everybody has another side. Some of us are in the middle of the lake. These events are no random storms. And even the little bumps in the road, we may have the ability to take care of that bump, but that is only because God gave us the ability to take care of it. Ultimately, I thought about this verse. Paul said, I have learned to be content in all things, right? Peace. I've learned to have peace, he's saying. I've learned to have peace in every situation, whether to be abounding or whether to be abased, right? Whether the day is going well or the day blows, right? I've got peace. I've learned. He didn't say, I'm guessing how to have peace. This is a process by which we are taking our faith from this life, these things that we trust in, and we're placing our faith in the one who controls, the one who gives and takes away. Blessed be his name. Don't fear him who can kill the body only, right? But fear him who can kill the body and cast the soul into hell. And so they say, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? You see, there's so much more to our faith because our faith is placed in an infinite God. He is not limited. He can do exceedingly abundantly more than we can ask or think, according to the power that works in us, according to the faith. He went into his own hometown and he could not do many miracles because of their unbelief. And the biggest miracle is that we have peace in these calamities. We have trust. We have faith. We have hope. We are not shaken. We are not moved.